My name is Kylie Message-Jones, for those of you who don't know me. I'm Director of the Humanities Research Centre here at the ANU. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting today on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Their sovereignty was never ceded, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. I also acknowledge all First Nations people who might be joining us here tonight. Tonight's distinguished HRC lecture is the culmination of a week of extraordinary events and celebrations that have been held to commemorate the 50-year anniversary of the Humanities Research Centre at ANU. The HRC, or the Humanities Research Centre, advances the production, dissemination and public translation of outstanding and innovative research in the humanities across the Australian National University, as well as nationally and globally. It's one of hundreds of humanities research centres around the world that all work to protect and extend creative, critical, and most of all, topical thinking on questions like what it means to be human, which is, of course, the core question upon which all societies are based. We do our work by supporting the production of advanced research across all humanities disciplines and all disciplines and fields of research that relate in some ways to the humanities. One of the things that we at the ANU HRC are proud of is that we're renowned for working across academic and public contexts to recognise, share, understand and platform intellectual excellence and contributions to knowledge from across all sectors. Located here in Canberra, obviously, we have valued partnerships, including with many of the national cultural and collecting institutions and other organisations. And some of you may have seen the booklet out the front. That's our second most recent annual report, and that provides some more information about the HRC. Indeed, collaboration has been a benchmark of all of our activities over this past birthday week. And these have included heritage walks, presentations by public intellectual activist writers, collaborations with First Nations artists, and tea tastings that brought together academics along with leading community experts and enthusiasts from across the country. So many of you will know the HRC already, but if you don't, please do look us up online or reach out to us in whatever way suits you. But tonight's activity, tonight's event, is a rare and unique pleasure for us. A distinguished lecture in celebration of our centre's 50th year anniversary. Tonight's speaker will be shortly introduced by the HRC Deputy Director, Dr. Kim Hun. Kim will already be known to many of you for his tireless commitment to and stellar work across academic, community and public sectors.
Hi everyone, Yumatiol too. Many of you know Scott Stevens as host of the Minefield on ABC Radio National. You probably know then that he's a world-class thinker, author, and as you'll soon witness, a world-class orator. What you should also know is that he's editor of the ABC Religion and Ethics website. And if you go there after this lecture, you'll see essays on contemporary stoicism, outrage over Olympic paganism, political violence, and the art of living, and much more. It's through this role that Scott, like no one else, I reckon, is tapped into the heart, the mind, and the soul of this nation. So can I ask you to imagine what it's been like of late to be connected in this way? What it's been like to receive passionate and often conflicting submissions about the Indigenous voice to Parliament and the war in Gaza, amongst many other issues. And what it's been like to manage, craft and do justice to all these words, these beliefs and these people. Scott does this with attention, with generosity and immense skill. He is a major figure in Australia's intellectual and media landscape. For the 50th anniversary of the ANU Humanities Research Centre, Scott will guide us in how to withstand the threats to our shared humanity. The only way to fight the plague, he says, is with decency. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim. That was incredibly kind. I'll just try to be deserving. Good heavens. Thank you all for being here on a cold midweek. What on earth are you doing here? That's my most pressing question. It really is a great honor to be here with you all, especially to join during this week of celebration on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people who I too acknowledge with gratitude and respect. But especially, I think, to join you during a week of celebrations whose express purpose is to commend the institutions and habits that sustain the possibility of a common humanity and a vibrant democratic culture. And I'm truly grateful to Kylie, to Kim, to Melinda for the invitation to be here with you tonight. I'm a little bit bitter, though, I wasn't here for the tea tasting. I mean, you couldn't have had me just one day before? God. I would like to use the occasion of this lecture to continue a line of thinking that has preoccupied me ever since the pandemic. It's something that Walid Ali and I wrote about a couple years ago in our quarterly essay, Uncivil Wars, How Contempt is Corroding Democracy. It's something I wanted to pursue a little bit further in the Simone Weil lecture on human value at Australian Catholic University at the end of 2022, a lecture that was then published in the journal Meanjin. It involves a concern with what might be called the conditions of democratic life. The conditions of democratic life, an expression which is meant to designate not so much really the spaces that human beings inhabit within a democracy, social or political, natural or institutional, rural or urban, but rather the term is meant to suggest the communicative spaces between us, remembering, which I hope you do, that the Latin word conditions, the Latin word upon which the term conditions is based, pictures the act of speaking together. These spaces are the medium in which and through which we meet one another, not as rivals or as ideological abstractions, as bearers of this or that political position, but as fellow human beings, as citizens with a stake in our common life, as participants in a shared democratic project, which is to say, these conditions of democratic life are the conversational spaces within which we might encounter the moral reality of others, encounters which then demand of us a particular degree of sensitivity, of tact, of responsiveness, of care. During these 5 years since the pandemic, I found myself repeatedly drawn again and again to the work of a series of thinkers and writers, some of them philosophers, poets, novelists, historians, each of whom I've come to think of as a custodian of the between. If you'll permit that really awkward phrase, I've got German in mind when I say it. There's the German Jewish philosopher Martin Buber used this lovely term zwischen, which means the between, the space between two people, the space where everything that is worthwhile within human life takes place. I've come to think of these thinkers, these writers, as custodians or cultivators or tenders of the between. Each one of them, each one of these thinkers was acutely aware of the latent tendencies, the dispositions that threaten to divide us from one another, rendering us in front of each other incommunicative, suspicious, contemptuous, inattentive to one another's aspirations, unresponsive to one another's pain, or otherwise blind to our shared humanity. It would be accurate to say that each one of these thinkers was alert to different threats to democracy, to use a bit of an overused term in our time. But they didn't think of these threats in the sense of being threats that jeopardized the conduct of free and fair elections, or that disenfranchised a portion of the population, or that disrupted the peaceful transition of power, or that co-opted the judiciary, or that contemplated political violence. All of those are threats to democracy. But what so concerned these writers was not the full frontal assault on the integrity of democratic institutions, precious as those institutions are. It was instead the persistence and the insidious spread of a kind of malaise, a sickness that threatened to dissolve the conditions of democratic life from within. Let me give you a sense of what I mean. In 1939, Nazism had its fair share of American admirers. Some panderers, others demagogues, most debauched intellectuals and brazen anti-Semites, all of whom looked longingly across the Atlantic, wrote cloying op-eds commending the political benefits of intelligent fascism, quote, and addressed America First rallies about the need to oppose godless communism at all costs in the name of Christian civilization. Among these apologists and sympathizers were the likes of H.L. Mencken, Lawrence Dennis, Elizabeth Dilling, Father Charles Coughlin, Merwin Hart, Charles Lindbergh. The philosopher John Dewey, for his part, would have none of it. He saw Nazism for the evil that it was and placed fascism far beyond the bounds of principled accommodation, much less craven emulation. And yet, even after Hitler's invasion of Poland, Dewey could write this in October 1939. To denounce Nazism for intolerance, cruelty, and stimulation of hatred amounts to fostering insincerity if in our personal relations to other persons, if in our daily walk and conversation, we are moved by racial, color, and other class prejudice. He goes on. Intolerance, abuse, calling of names because of differences of opinion about religion or politics or business, as well as because of differences of race or color or wealth or degree of culture. These are treason to the democratic way of life. For everything, Dewey says, which bars freedom and fullness of communication sets up barriers that divide human beings into sects and cliques, into antagonistic sects and factions, and thereby undermines the democratic way of life. Without in any way minimizing the Nazi threat without, Dewey stresses that neglecting these weaknesses, these tendencies for division, for barrier making, for intolerance, for mutual suspicion, undermine us from within. Dewey would thus repeatedly stress the importance of moving beyond our tendency to think of democracy as something purely institutional and external, and to cultivate instead the habit of treating democracy as a way of personal life, which is sustained through conversation, cooperation, and common decency, fully as much as it is at the ballot box. For Dewey, it's precisely the day-to-day adoption of such practices, conversation, cooperation, decency, and their contagious diffusion through every phase of human life that permits democracy to become not just a political reality, but a moral reality. It's fully to be expected, I think, in disorienting times when we're trying to find our bearings, when we perceive threats to democracy on every side. It's to be expected that people would look to an earlier era for solace or guidance. And yet I'll confess that over the last 8 years, I've often wished that more people turned to someone like Dewey in response to the threats that we face, rather than, say, to George Orwell's 1984. a novel which you'll remember soon after Donald Trump was elected overtook J.D. Vance's best-selling memoir Hillbilly Elegy at the top of Amazon's sales ranking, as many voters began to grow steadily less interested in understanding how their fellow citizens could vote for that man, and they became more concerned with the seemingly authoritarian trajectory that the United States had placed itself on. Don't get me wrong, it's not that Orwell has nothing to say to our political moment. He does, about the desiccation of language, about the flattening out of concepts, about the ubiquity of screens, about the impoverishment of memory, about the erosion of trust, about the fragility of truth. But that's not what evidently piqued readers' interests in Orwell's novel in the early days of the Trump presidency. It was more like a knee-jerk response to the prospect of totalitarianism US style, having already forgotten, for many of them, America's long history of fascist dalliances and flirtations with dictators, and searching around instead for a post-war European example close at hand. After all authoritarianism only comes from Europe, right? So many of these readers, traumatized by Trump's election, then searched for the example that Orwell provided, an example which would then have the added benefit of casting them in the desirable role, having already been traumatized by Trump's ascendancy, in the heroic posture of belonging to the resistance. Again, don't get me wrong, 1984 is not a bad novel to turn to in moments of political crisis, but not if doing so concentrates our attention entirely on the threat without, to such an extent that we overlook the deterioration within that allows the rise of a Potemkin despot like Donald Trump in the first place. Something similar happened. People reaching for a novel but not quite getting the point. Something similar happened in 2020, when many of those who found themselves confined to their homes and isolated from their neighbors during the pandemic discovered a 1947 novel by a French author, playwright, and intellectual named Albert Camus. It was a novel about the outbreak of a mysterious illness in the Algerian coastal city of Oran. The novel was called The Plague. It makes sense, doesn't it, that those of us who were living through our own plague year would seek solace in the experiences of residents of a plague-ravaged town cut off from the rest of the world. But for those people who turned to the novel hoping for stories of individual resilience in the face of indiscriminate illness, or those who were hoping for an account of the tedium of isolation and the struggle to hold on to meaning despite the repetition of days without end, I think they were bound to be disappointed. Interestingly enough, the other object that a lot of people rediscovered during the pandemic was Harold Ramis's 1993 film Groundhog Day. Another example of quite a good film, but entirely missing the point. No, The Plague is not that kind of story. Instead, Camus provides an account of a collective struggle to hold on to something precious in the face of a threat whose power it is to render human beings profoundly unreal to one another, and so beyond the reach of appeals to sympathy. A threat capable of dissolving the bonds of communality by turning human beings into mere bearers of a contagion, and therefore threats. A threat that can so pollute the air in between human beings that it suffocates their moral imaginations, leading them, in Camus' novel, to justify the killing of others as a way of combating the plague, all the while failing to see that by killing, they demonstrate that they themselves are infected by it. The plague, you see, is Camus' allegory for life under occupation during the Second World War. But far from reducing Nazism to a kind of pestilence that breaks out in the middle of nowhere and after a while disappears of its own accord. The novel instead reflects Camus' growing conviction that during those years of occupation and resistance, something dormant had been awoken. It was a malaise whose effects, Camus believed, would outlast the war and would come finally to pose a threat to human community. Camus would call this malaise, the threat that it poses, the human crisis, la crise de l'homme. In a public lecture hosted by Columbia University in New York City, the 28th of March, 1946, a lecture which bore just this title, The Human Crisis. It's an extraordinary lecture. It's available in various forms. It's available with Viggo Mortensen performing it in the guise of Camus. Extraordinary lecture. Please find a way of reading it or watching it. In this lecture, The Human Crisis, Camus offered his audience a series of snippets, of vignettes from during the war to help them grasp the nature of the crisis that he was describing. Camus told, for instance, of a concierge who dutifully mops up the mess around two suspects who had been tortured by the Gestapo, but who offers them no aid. I never interfere with what my tenants do. Camus tells of a German officer who asks an elderly mother to choose which of her 3 sons he should spare. Camus tells of a torturer who matter-of-factly inquires of his victim, whose mutilated ears were still bloodied and bandaged. And how are your ears then? In each instance, the words that are spoken are not addressed to another human being, someone to whom tenderness or sympathy could be shown, someone who might arrest the performance of one's duties, someone to whom consideration would be owed. Instead, these words are addressed to a thing, an object, an obstacle, an impediment. And in each instance, Camus invites his audience to imagine what words could have been spoken by the victim that would bring their oppressors, their torturers, or bystanders alike to their senses. What objection could be raised? What plea for sympathy? There is, after all, clearly between them no shared medium that would bring their plaintive cries or pleas to the other person's hearing. There's no minimal recognition that they each bear a common humanity. On what basis, then, could such an appeal be made? In the absence of a shared medium, the victim's words were always destined to fall on deaf ears. What, we have to ask, what could account for the inhumanity of such a response to another human being in distress? What could explain the callousness, the soul blindness? 20 years after Camus' lecture on the human crisis, the American philosopher Stanley Cavell made a vital distinction. I find myself thinking about it almost daily. A vital distinction that I think helps us answer this question. It's a distinction, Cavell says, between the failure to know that another person is in pain and the failure to acknowledge that pain. The failure to know, Cavell says, could simply be a matter of ignorance. I can't tell. It could be an absence, a blank. I don't know enough. I don't have enough information. The failure to acknowledge, on the other hand, indicates not the absence of something, but the presence of something. The presence of something, Cavell says, an indifference, a callousness, an exhaustion, a coldness. He goes on spiritual emptiness is not a blank. What, then, could have inserted itself, could have imposed itself between the people in Camus' vignettes so as to render one utterly impervious to the moral reality, to the evident pain, to the distress of the other? In a striking phrase, Camus assigns the blame to what he calls the worship of efficiency and abstraction. The worship of efficiency and abstraction. By the former, efficiency, he means to evoke what he calls the dominion of bureaucracy and automation. The way that these two things hold sway over people's lives. Their power resides in their opacity, their size, the sheer heedlessness of their functioning. We might even say their inevitability. They are unresponsive bureaucracies and automation. They are unresponsive to the vulnerability, the contingency of human life, because the ends that these machines or these bureaucracies serve are extraneous to human well-being. They seem to obey some other law, unknown and unknowable, before human beings must shrink, or else under which they will be crushed. That's efficiency. What about abstraction? It's a strange term, but a vital one. For abstraction, Camus has something slightly different in mind. He doesn't mean the heedless functioning of a vast bureaucracy. He doesn't mean the huge rumbling forward of an unstoppable automated machine. He associates abstraction with devotion to an ideology, a philosophy, a theory, or a religion, which at once replaces human passions, human emotions like pity and empathy and remorse and love, the emotions of everyday life, the emotions that are evoked when human beings see another human being in distress. He says, abstraction is an ideology which replaces human passions with what he calls collective passions or abstract passions. Passions like fanaticism, zeal, partisan or party loyalty, chauvinistic nationalism. When a person becomes possessed, Camus was a great admirer of Dostoevsky's novel, The Possessed, by the way. When a person becomes possessed by such passions, it has the effect of turning, in their eyes, real human beings into mere avatars, reducing them to the status of either combatants in a zero-sum struggle or collateral to be sacrificed on the altar of some cause. In both cases, efficiency or abstraction, in both cases, the possibility of a moral encounter between persons, as when one person appeals to the humanity of another, "Can't you see I'm hurting?" Or when one person tries to awaken in another the recognition of the wrong that they are committing, "How could you do this to another human being?" Such appeals are foreclosed by the weight of an artificiality which renders human beings less real to one another. For neither machines nor abstractions afford human beings the room to breathe, let alone speak. Machines and abstractions don't take time together. They don't learn to live with one another. Machines and abstractions lay claim to the whole of human life and demand absolute submission. Hence Camus' characterization of their adherents in religious terms. He says they are members of a cult. This is what happens when politics exceeds its proper bounds and comes to take over and define our entire identities and interactions, when we become political activists all the way down. It becomes a form of what might be called political idolatry, where we are made for politics instead of politics is made for us. The great misfortune of our time, says Camus, is precisely that politics claims to provide us simultaneously with a catechism, a complete philosophy, and sometimes even an art of love. Politics advises us how to live entirely, completely. And yet, he tells his audience, it's a phrase I've come to love, the role of politics is to do the housework, not to perform marriage counseling. With a wry smile, no doubt, Camus is here subtly but unmistakably drawing on an alternative philosophical tradition, one that goes back to Plato and Aristotle, that sees politics not primarily as about power or force or responsibility or even order, but rather that sees politics as a matter of cultivating or attending to the conditions of our common life. Politics, we could say, is what emerges organically out of a people's concern to care for the conditions of human communality. But once politics overwhelms life, such that people are neither wholly present to one another in conversation, nor responsive to one another's calls to turn away from forms of life that are ignoble or brutish or mutually demeaning, then human beings turn themselves and one another into abstractions. For Camus, one of the enduring consequences of the Second World War and its all-consuming politics was the way, he said, it devastated an entire generation's life, the way that it corrupted and destroyed their faith in the capacity of human conversation and nonviolent persuasion. Let me read this to you. This is from an editorial he wrote in the same year as the Human Crisis from 1946. No one today is talking because the world seems to be led by forces blind and deaf to warnings, advice, supplications. Something in us has succumbed to recent experience, referring to the experience of resistance, of occupation, of war. Something in us has succumbed, much the same way that one might succumb to an illness. That something is humanity's eternal confidence, which always fostered the belief that we could elicit human reactions from other human beings by speaking to them in the language of humanity. We have witnessed lying, humiliation, killing, deportation, and torture. And in each instance, it was impossible to persuade the people who were doing these things not to do them because they were sure of themselves and because there is no way of persuading an abstraction. Thus, Camus says, the long dialogue among human beings has come to an end. It would be a mistake, however, a mistake that's easy to fall into in the context of a discussion like this. It would be a mistake, however, to imagine that this malaise of moral unresponsiveness is confined only to extraordinary situations, the horror of a concentration camp, say, or to a Gestapo's interrogation room. Instead, Camus reminds us that this cult of abstraction and automation has also corrupted our ordinary modes of human communication. In language that anticipates perhaps the most egregious aspects of the media culture of the 21st century, with its unrelenting stream of hot takes and takedowns, with its rituals of public humiliation and gaudy displays of moral vanity, with its casual indifference to bullshit and its willingness to weaponize truth claims for partisan advantage, Camus describes the pathologies of what he calls his own century of polemic and insult. This is Camus writing in 1949. In 1949. Between nations and individuals, polemic now holds the place which was traditionally held by dialogue. Day and night, thousands of voices, each pursuing from its own noisy corner, a noisy monologue, unleash on our peoples a torrent of mystifying words. But what is the mechanism of polemic? It consists in viewing the opponent as an enemy and consequently simplifying him and refusing to see him. When I insult a person, I no longer know the color of his gaze. Let me read that again. When I insult a person, I no longer know the color of his gaze. Thanks to polemic, we no longer live in a world of human beings, but in a world of shapes. This is what it means for the long dialogue among human beings to come to an end. The language of humanity lost amid the cacophony of competing monologues and self-serving polemic. And the sickening irony is that the very technologies of mass communication that promise to incline the hearts of peoples within nations and between nations towards one another, that these very technologies would bring about this crisis of incommunicativity. Once again, Camus places himself here among a notable counter-tradition of philosophers and novelists, Dostoevsky, Flaubert among them, who cast doubt on the prevailing enthusiasm over the moral advance that would invariably accompany the growth of the popular press in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Instead, these novelists and thinkers and writers feared that mass communication would not enhance the quality of responsiveness to human speech, but instead would render language all the more abstract, superficial, performative. Eventually, as Søren Kierkegaard, the great Danish philosopher, foretold in 1846, fully a century before Camus' lecture on the human crisis. As Søren Kierkegaard foretold, words would eventually be manufactured in much the same way commodities are, leading to the uncanny phenomenon of speech without a speaker, of language devoid of either intention or understanding. Kierkegaard writes, "There will no longer be someone who speaks, but an abstract noise that will render human speech superfluous, just as machines have rendered workers superfluous." It's hard to think of a better description of the emergence in our time of generative AI, of quasi-linguistic tools that answer questions by constructing plausible-sounding sentences based on the statistical relationship between adjacent phrases as they occur in the internet. These chatbots, writes Stephen Marsh, as if realizing Kierkegaard's prophecy, these chatbots create an object that is a subject, voices that aren't voices, faces that aren't faces. And as the remaining forms of human communication gradually become overwhelmed by the torrent of automated word production, getting lost in the big blur, as Marsh calls it, what is left that might be considered distinctly human language risks being reduced to little more than the passing continuation of past patterns of human speech, coughed up and spat out on occasion. The human crisis, as Camus conceived it, represents nothing less than humanity's estrangement from the vital medium that sustains our common life and that bears our words to one another in such a way that they might be expected to elicit a human response. And so what Camus calls a world of abstraction and automation designates the many ways that human beings have found to avoid the moral reality of other persons, seeking refuge in the craven certainty of unanswerable speech, whether that be the cold sterility of bureaucratic language or the hotter trades of polemic and insult. All the while, human beings risk becoming incapable of the kinds of conversations upon which democratic life depends. The question, I think, before us is this: can human beings survive that loss? The loss of conversation, the loss of the language of humanity. Is there life outside the language of humanity? I'm inclined at this point to reach for a cryptic remark from Wittgenstein. There is no outside. Outside, you cannot breathe. If we are, morally speaking, never more fully alive than when we are in genuine conversation with others, then a world in which conversation has become impossible threatens to consign human beings to a state of moral suffocation. As Camus would write in 1946, we gasp for air among people who believe they are absolutely right, whether it be in their machines or their ideas, and for all who cannot live without dialogue and the friendship of other human beings. This silence is the end of the world. To gasp for air, we could say, would be to find oneself without recourse to the language of humanity, to be excluded from the moral register in which human beings can appeal to the humanity of another, calling them to give an account of themselves or their actions, calling them to fully own their words, calling them to change their minds or amend their ways on the basis of the recognition of something irreducibly precious that we share. Other forms of speech may try this. They might be well-meaning, they might be sincere, but they won't have the ring of truth about them. Not least because other forms of speech, other than the language of humanity, cannot expose the speaker to the reality of another person in such a way that invites the kind of moral encounter that ushers the two people to the precipice of friendship, whether that be democratic or intimate. The precipice of friendship where they realize that depending on the way I respond to this moment, to this challenge, to these words, life will be changed. Our relationship will be changed. For such moments of moral encounter, what is needed is a language through which human beings can express the particularity, the specificity of the pain that they have suffered, or the injustice that they have endured, in which they can express the hopes to which they aspire. It's a language that humans can, in turn, offer the kind of response to another's pain that suggests an acknowledgement far more profound than solidarity, and a grief much deeper than regret. Such language refuses the relative safety of anonymity and distance and demands something more powerful, vulnerable, like individuality and presence. The language of humanity requires that we risk breathing the same air. It risks that we expose ourselves to the difficulty of another's moral reality. It's by no means coincidental that towards the end of his novel, The Plague, Camus refers to the plague as the abstraction, and that its effect is to obscure the humanity of those in its grip and to isolate them from one another. The characters at the heart of Camus' novel, each in their own way, try desperately to preserve a sense of humanity, lest it be lost in the very effort to combat the plague. The character Grand, for instance, if you've read the novel, he's the one who keeps writing the same sentence over and over again, hoping to finally perfect just this one sentence, to perfect just one sentence, man after my own heart. Grand, for instance, through his own perfectionism, strives for a truer, clearer language, not the language of generality, not the language of bureaucratic obscurantism. He strives for a truer, clearer language through which to present the statistics, the illnesses, the fatalities needed to direct the efforts of public health workers. He's the only character that the novel names as a real hero. The character Taru keeps a daily diary, a chronicle of the insignificant moments of human life, moments of tenderness, of joyfulness, of silliness, of grief. Insignificant moments of human life in Oran under the conditions of the plague. But it's Dr. Rieu's reflection. He ends up being the narrator of the novel. It's Dr. Rieu's reflection that is perhaps for us, for now, the most arresting. This whole thing, the doctor says, is not about heroism. It's about decency. It may seem a ridiculous idea, but the only way to fight the plague is with decency. It is decency, which, Rieu says, consists in doing my job. It's decency that allows him to look past the isolations and the divisions and the antagonisms imposed by the plague, and to see instead the patient as worthy of attentiveness and care. Decency, after all, is not about the person who exhibits it. Decency is about the preciousness of the one to whom it is shown. Often think of decency as a window through which one looks. When a person is treated with decency, the purpose of that form of action is to direct attention not to the modesty of the one being decent, but of the worthiness of the one being shown decency. Decency is the refusal of every abstraction that would erect a barrier between us, forbidding sympathy for and conversation with another. Decency belongs to the register of the language of humanity, not politics, not philosophy, not ideology. Decency is what Camus expresses when he writes a little scribble, a correction perhaps, that he then tried to rub out, in the margins of an editorial from the 19th of November, 1946. Decency is what Camus expresses when he writes, "For my part, I have learned over the past 2 years in particular that there is no truth I would place above the life of a human being." Decency is what Camus' strict contemporary, Vasily Grossman, will call a kind of private kindness shown by one individual towards another, a petty, thoughtless kindness, an unwitnessed kindness, something we could call senseless kindness, a kindness outside of any system of social or religious good. Vasily Grossman will go on to call this kindness that which is most truly human in a human being, the highest achievement of the soul. No, it says, life is not evil. At a time when politics seems to require of us that we allow ourselves to be enlisted in the struggle against evil, and at a moment when our words are more like crude weapons that we hurl over the barriers that we've erected against threatening others, perhaps it's the rediscovery of the importance of everyday decency. Perhaps it's the recommitment to becoming fluent in the language of humanity that represents our best chance of making democracy a moral reality. Thank you.
Before we open up the conversation, I'd love to get a couple of more tips about how to connect with each other and address the human crisis. Reading first. Not only a tip on not only what we should read, but perhaps more importantly, how we should read Scott Stephens.
Whenever this particular topic comes up, and it's something, I love Waleed. I really do. If the efforts of my life would be for him to read more novels, it would have been a life very, very well spent. We spend simply way too much time online, and that has the double effect of turning the people that we interact with online into abstractions, whether the abstraction of a byline or the abstraction of a person on the other side of a social media account. But I think more than that, the kind of language that circulates online, the kind of language that works online, is not the language that human beings speak to one another. If you want to know what I mean, go to any comment section. If you want to know what I mean, just log on to what used to be called Twitter. That's not how human beings talk to one another. And because of that, we've learned a kind of vernacular. We've learned a language that is harsher than it is human, that doesn't give one another the chance to breathe, but also that doesn't give us a chance to find the right word. Iris Murdoch, one of my favorite philosophers, I didn't mention her. Her influence was on just about every page of that, though. Iris Murdoch once said that the most moral of all the parts of speech is the adjective. Because with an adjective, you can either abstract another person or you can capture their essence. By scratching around in your dealings with another person for the right adjective to use about them. That's one of the ways that you are confronted by and respond to the humanity of another person. We've lost touch with the importance and the delicacy of language. We've lost a sense of the vitality and the moral significance of tact. But we know this in our interpersonal relationships, don't we? Anybody who has a significant relationship in their life knows that there are arguments that you can win, but by winning them, you can lose everything else in that relationship that matters. That's tact. That's the use of the language of humanity to find ways to speak to one another that negotiates our common life, but that doesn't lose everything that's precious and valuable in the process. It just seems to me spending less time online learning the wrong kind of language and instead learning the time that it takes to pick up a different vernacular, the kind of human speech that I think novels, as well as poetry, but I think particularly novels, provide. That's one of the ways that I think we relearn something that we are very, very, very close to forgetting.
Another tip on paying attention. What does paying attention mean to you?
Well, I mean, we hear all the time about an online attention deficit, that the time that we're willing to take with things has just gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. That's one part of attention, our ability to linger with something. But attention for someone like Iris Murdoch, but behind Iris Murdoch, Albert Camus, they weren't really friends. Camus revered her as a saint, Simone Weil. Attentiveness for Weil meant lingering in the presence of an object of love. Not being tempted to fill a pregnant silence with words or nervousness that's unworthy of that silence. Simone Weil likened attentiveness to what the heart does in a moment of totally focused prayer. A heart entirely focused on this one object of devotion. What does that mean to be in the presence of another person and to treat that person with due attentiveness? At another point, and this is in her great essay on the Iliad and violence, Simone Weil says human beings cannot be and should never be treated as obstacles, something you have to get around. But if you think about it, that's precisely the way that we treat our political opponents, the people that we disagree with. If we think about politics in terms of demography, my God, I can't wait until you all just die off so the next generation can take over and get things done. That's seeing people as obstacles that need to be gotten around rather than gifts that constitute the necessary conditions for a rich, democratic, and human life. So Simone Weil says that when you treat another human being like an obstacle, you're treating them like a thing, not something that's alive, but just something that's not yet dead. Whereas what a person does, and she uses a kind of gravitational metaphor, She says that treating a person as an object of attention, it ought to pull you into their orbit and lull you into, one of my favorite phrases, an interval of hesitation. Just waiting a moment in another person's presence, waiting another moment with the words that a person has spoken as they've spoken it, not assuming that I know what they really mean. I know what their agenda really is. Lingering in a person's presence in a manner that requires humility, that requires tact, that requires gentleness, knowing that one of the surest ways of constituting our democratic life is by finding ways of lingering in the presence of those that we are thrown together, yes, but there is no good life worth living that doesn't include them in it.
You know, Scott, I don't mind saying that I'm in love at the moment. And when you talk about paying attention like that, I know I'm in love because I pay attention to my partner. And I see markings that no one else would see. See the way she puts on her shoes. She can't help but sing when she's having a shower or something like that. And I just wonder, I can't love everyone in the same way that I love her, but I wonder if you can take a smidgen of that and say, to appreciate others. You can love them a little bit. You can pay attention to them and be decent to them in that way by lingering with someone rather than...
Absolutely. Look, in our quarterly essay, Walid and I finished the essay by drawing the connection between democracy and marriage. We were criticized for it. People told us that it's too high a bar. We don't have to love people within a common political community. We just have to learn how to tolerate them. That's right. I'm not talking about sort of being in love with anybody in the same way that I might truly love a dear friend. I might truly love my children. I might truly love my partner. That's not the nature of political, or I think a better term would be democratic love. What democratic love says is that our relationship is worth persevering with. It's a thing that I am glad is in the world. And our continuing on together is something that's worth fighting for. Again, this is something that Simone Weil pointed out quite beautifully. A marriage is not constituted by the exchanging of vows, or by the giving of gifts, or by the giving of rings. Marriage is constituted by the willingness on the part of both parties, each new morning, to continue on together. Because continuing on together is good. Marriage is constituted by the willingness to renew one's own dedication to being together in that friendship, in that common community, each new day. As soon as you think, wow, it's not as good as it used to be, or I really wish we could go back to the passion of the early days, you've lost something fundamental about the nature of marriage. Marriage's foundation, its moral basis, is reconstituted constantly, diurnally. It's constituted by nothing other than the renewal on the part of both to continue on together. And for all the importance that institutions have within a democracy, I feel like democracy is constituted in precisely the same way. It's the easiest thing in the world to see one another as others who simply must be tolerated, but if I can possibly do it, I probably want to get around them. But to use the language of love within a democracy is to say that I might disagree with you fundamentally, but I see the world differently because you're in it. And it's a good thing that I see the world differently because you're in it. Because I don't know everything. And because my opinion isn't infallible. There's a great American political philosopher, George Kateb, who says that when parties change power at each new election, having the other party in power gives us who are out the opportunity to see the whole world through their particular coloration. That's an extraordinary way, I think, to think about elections. And it's a wonderful antidote to seeing elections as these existential threats There are real threats to democracy. I just think they're fewer and further between than we might think.
I'll pass it on to the audience soon, but before we get too lovey-dovey, let's talk about the mainstream media and its decency or otherwise. Your former colleague, Stan Grant, now professor at Monash University, he was here last year, and it's hard to summarise, but he leant towards talking about the indecency of the mainstream media. And particularly, I think he talked about the lack of intellectual and moral courage that had come over the mainstream media. Your thoughts on that observation and what can be done?
The language of the media is the language of abstraction. I mean, that is what the media does. I don't know if it's necessary mode of communication, if it's an inherent language, but that is its language. It turns people into causes. It turns events into historical moments, or even worse, it turns people into something to be debated over. Stan's moral contribution over the course of the referendum debate, I thought, was peerless, for the simple reason that he urged silence and consideration where instead there was antagonism and mutual suspicion. He urged a different type of language that needed to be brought to bear when the fate and the agency and the political constitution of a people was under question. Whether or not they should have been under question in the first place, I think, is another matter altogether. Stan reaches repeatedly to the language of poetry that's cultivated in the context, in the grounds of silence. You know, I made reference to Søren Kierkegaard before. His extraordinarily prescient reflections on the artificial manufacturing of words, and artificial manufacturing of words that would overwhelm human language. One of the other things that Kierkegaard wrote passionately about is the detrimental effect of opinion pieces, opinion articles in newspapers. He said, what does an opinion article do in the popular press? What does it do? Well, it tells you what to think. It tells you what to believe. It doesn't just tell you what's happened someplace. It tells you what to think about what's happened in someplace. In other words, opinion pieces are catering to the intellectual and moral laziness of the readers. He says, what should we do in response to something that seems intractably difficult, that is meant to exercise our souls, but we just don't know what to think about it? He says, Kierkegaard says, the response to that is to retreat into interiority. His idea of interiority is an incubator. I actually love it. You place an issue in the inner incubator and you wait and you think and you turn it over and you mull it over and you think about how this is going to affect others, and you allow the chords of sympathy and empathy and pity and remorse to reach out. And after a while, only when you think you can say words that you can stand by, does the egg hatch and does an opinion come out. We are terrified by interiority, fully as much as we're terrified by blank pages. We're terrified of interiority, so we want someone else to give us the opinion that we ought to have in the first place. That's what the media does. The media has a vital role within a democracy, but the media can also overwhelm the interior life, suffocating our ability to be silent, to be contemplative, to be patient, and to be humble. This is one of the other things that reading novels does. It not only gives us a different language to the prevailing language of politics and media, it also gives us spaces of silence within which the interior life can develop and mature.